like a heavy stone dropping into a perfectly still, crystal-clear pond. The silver fork held by Isabella Montgomery remained completely suspended in the air, caught halfway between the exquisite porcelain plate and her lips. All around her, the hushed, polite conversations of the wealthy patrons died out one by one, extinguishing like fragile candle flames blown out by a sudden, freezing wind. Even the talented pianist, playing softly in the far corner, missed a note, momentarily distracted by the shocking intrusion into their exclusive world. Isabella lifted her gaze slowly, her sharp eyes taking in the sight before her. Standing right across from her, hovering nervously by the immaculate table, was a young woman who could not have been older than 26 years of age. She wore a faded gray shirt that was badly torn at the shoulders, trousers that were completely frayed at the knees, and shoes so terribly worn down that they barely retained any recognizable shape. Slung heavily over her fragile shoulder was an enormous, bulging black trash bag tied with a tight knot, looking as though it contained her entire worldly existence. Her face was heavily smudged with dark dirt, but a few clean tracks cut right through the grime, leaving the undeniable, fresh traces of recent tears. However, what truly made Isabella's heart stop beating in her chest was not the filthy clothing or the dirt. It was the girl's eyes. They were large, dark and framed by incredibly long lashes, holding a quiet, unbreakable dignity that extreme poverty had somehow failed to erase. They were eyes that Isabella knew intimately, eyes that had haunted her every single dream for the past 22 years. "What did you say, child?" Isabella asked, and her voice, which was normally so firm, authoritative, and perfectly accustomed to barking orders in high-stakes corporate boardrooms, came out terribly broken, barely more than a fragile whisper. The young girl immediately lowered her head in deep shame. A bright flush of embarrassment ignited her cheeks beneath the heavy layers of street dirt. "Please forgive me. I really did not mean to bother you at all. It is just that." She paused, swallowing hard as her dry throat made a clicking sound. "I saw that you were going to leave the warm bread and half of the expensive fish, and I—" Her voice cracked with overwhelming emotion. "Just forget it. I am so terribly sorry. Have a good day." She quickly turned around, desperately eager to walk away and disappear back into the unforgiving streets of the historic city. "Wait!" The word burst out of Isabella's mouth before her rational mind could even process the thought. Several heads whipped around from the neighboring tables, their eyes wide with shock. A wealthy woman wearing a heavy emerald necklace clicked her tongue with profound, undisguised contempt. A businessman dressed in a sharp gray suit muttered something incredibly harsh to his dining companion, pointing his chin at the young girl, as if he were gesturing toward a stray, flea-bitten dog that had somehow wandered into a private, manicured garden. The restaurant's general manager, a slender, nervous man named Robert, was already rushing over at a very fast pace. He had his hands extended outward, and a perfectly painted, apologetic smile plastered across his face. "Mrs. Montgomery, I beg 1,000 pardons for this horrific interruption," he groveled before turning toward the young girl with a suddenly cruel, hardened expression. "And you. I have told you 1,000 times that you absolutely cannot enter this establishment. Get out right now before I call the security guards." He forcefully grabbed the young woman by her thin arm. "Do not touch her." Isabella's command violently cut through the tense air of the dining room. She did not yell. She simply did not need to. Isabella Montgomery had single-handedly built a massive real estate and luxury hotel empire that spanned across 3 continents, and whenever she spoke in that particular, chilling tone, the entire world stopped to listen. Robert immediately dropped the girl's arm as if her skin were burning hot. "But, ma'am, this homeless vagrant," he stammered nervously. "This young lady," Isabella corrected him sharply, emphasizing every single syllable, "is my esteemed guest. Bring her a comfortable chair and a completely clean set of silverware immediately." The silence inside the upscale restaurant became so incredibly dense and heavy that one could practically slice it with a knife. The arrogant woman with the emerald necklace accidentally dropped her crystal wine glass, which clinked loudly against her plate. The businessman in the gray suit simply sat there with his mouth hanging wide open in utter disbelief. Ma'am, this is really not necessary, the young girl stammered, taking a frightened step backward toward the exit. Truly, I do not want to cause you any trouble at all. Every single person in this room is staring at you. Please, do not go through this immense trouble for someone like me. I am simply not worth it. Isabella repeated those heartbreaking words quietly, under her breath, and a sharp pain pierced her chest like a jagged wooden splinter. Who on earth ever told you that? Isabella asked softly. The young girl did not offer an answer. She merely lowered her gaze back down to her horribly ruined shoes. Please sit down, Isabella said. And this time her words were not issued as a corporate command, but rather as a desperate plea, cleverly disguised as an order. An old woman like me really should not have to eat her lunch entirely alone. You would be doing me a massive favor. Robert, completely defeated and terrified for his job, dragged a heavy wrought iron chair over and placed it directly across from Isabella, letting out a quiet sigh of deep resignation. The girl stared at the plush chair as if it were an elaborate, dangerous trap waiting to snap shut. She then looked up at Isabella, and within those billionaire eyes that were typically so accustomed to the cold, hard calculations of the ruthless business world, she found something she never expected to see: pure, unadulterated tenderness. She slowly sat down on the very edge of the chair, absolutely refusing to let go of her black trash bag, tightly hugging it against her chest as if it were a protective shield. "What is your name?" Isabella asked gently. "Lily," she responded in a voice that was barely audible. "Lily Sanders." Isabella closed her eyes for a brief, agonizing moment. The name was completely different, but those eyes were exactly the same. The exact same beautiful, dark eyes of her precious Victoria. "Are you hungry, Lily?" Isabella asked, her heart aching. The young woman nodded her head quickly, and two fresh, heavy tears slid down her face, carving new, clean paths through the dirt on her pale cheeks. "Very much, ma'am. Please forgive me. It has been so incredibly long since I have eaten anything hot that I truly cannot even remember what it tastes like." Isabella felt her heart painfully contract within her chest. She raised her hand high, and, without ever taking her eyes off the young woman, summoned the terrified manager with a sharp wave. "Robert," her voice was now quite soft but absolutely implacable, "I want you to bring the very best dishes this kitchen can produce directly to this table. The freshest catch of the day, the hottest clam chowder, the most perfectly baked bread, absolutely everything. Add a rich chocolate dessert and a large pitcher of freshly squeezed orange juice." Robert stared at her in total disbelief. "For the young lady?" he asked. "For my guest," Isabella repeated, slowly spelling out her words. "And while your chefs are rapidly preparing that feast, take these used plates away and bring us crisp, pristine white tablecloths. My guest absolutely deserves to eat at a perfectly dignified table." The Grand Montgomery estate stood majestically at the very top of a beautiful, sweeping hill located right near the famous Battery of Charleston, entirely surrounded by deeply silent, manicured gardens and towering oak trees draped in ancient Spanish moss that swayed beautifully under the starry southern sky. When the long, sleek black limousine passed through the enormous wrought iron gates and slowly made its way up the sprawling gravel driveway, Lily pressed her face hard against the cool tinted glass, her mouth hanging wide open in utter awe. "You actually live here?" she whispered in a state of total shock. "But this place is so much bigger than the entire orphanage. It is bigger than 3 orphanages combined." Isabella offered a sad, heavy sigh as she looked out at her immense property. "It is far too big," she replied softly. "A massive house exactly like this one, without a single soul to fill its halls with joyous noise, is not a real home. It is merely a very elegant, incredibly lonely museum." The heavy limousine gently rolled to a complete stop right in front of a sweeping, spectacular marble staircase. The uniformed driver quickly opened the thick door, and Lily stepped out with extreme timidity, still tightly clutching her black garbage bag, feeling more completely out of place than she ever had in her entire life. A stern-looking older woman wearing a perfectly starched white apron stood waiting for them at the massive front doors. This was Clara, the fiercely loyal housekeeper who had proudly served Isabella for over 30 years. Clara carefully looked Lily up and down, taking in the torn, filthy clothing, the heavy street dirt, and the ugly black bag, before finally looking at her wealthy employer with her eyebrows raised high in a completely silent, highly judgmental question. Clara Isabella spoke with an undeniable authority. "This is Lily. She will be staying with us for a while. Please immediately prepare the blue room, draw a hot bath filled with soothing salts, and search through my personal closets to find some comfortable clothes that might fit her properly." "The blue room, ma'am," Clara gasped loudly, completely unable to hide her profound, trembling astonishment. They had kept that specific, tragic door securely locked for over 2 full decades. "Yes," Isabella responded with unwavering firmness, even though her voice betrayed a tiny, almost imperceptible quiver. "The blue room." Clara slowly nodded her head, instantly understanding that something incredibly monumental was occurring, and she gently guided the exhausted young girl into the spectacular, cavernous interior of the mansion. As Lily slowly ascended the massive, sweeping marble staircase, staring in absolute wonder at the gorgeous oil portraits and the glittering crystal chandeliers, Isabella remained firmly planted at the bottom of the steps, silently watching her go. Once Lily finally disappeared down the long, luxurious upstairs hallway, Isabella's legs suddenly gave out completely. She had to grip the polished wooden banister with all her remaining strength just to keep herself from collapsing onto the hard floor. The blue room had been kept shut for 22 agonizing years. 22 years of thick dust covering a beautiful wooden crib that was never once used, soft stuffed toys that were never playfully touched, and a gorgeous mural of fluffy white clouds painted on the ceiling by a loving father mere weeks before the unspeakable tragedy. Isabella forced herself up the stairs and walked straight into her private, oak-paneled study. She quickly locked the heavy wooden door behind her and, for the first time in a very long while, opened the hidden wall safe concealed neatly behind a beautiful landscape painting. From the dark depths of the safe, she pulled out a small, worn velvet box. Inside rested a slightly yellowed photograph, a tiny hospital bracelet meant for an infant, and an official piece of paper. The old photograph showed a significantly younger, brilliantly radiant Isabella, tenderly holding a newborn baby, tightly wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Standing right beside her in the photo was an incredibly handsome man smiling brightly. That was Edward, her beloved husband, who tragically died of a massive heart attack just 3 short years after that picture was taken. The beautiful baby in the picture had her tiny eyes closed, but Isabella flawlessly knew every single millimeter of that precious face completely by heart. "Victoria," she whispered into the empty room, gently tracing the photograph with a badly trembling finger. "Her daughter, her one and only child, born after many long years of exhausting medical treatments, completely shattered hopes and endless tearful prayers. They had cruelly told her that the baby died at exactly 6 months of age. A sudden, terrifyingly high fever on a terribly rainy night, a desperate, speeding car ride to the emergency room, and then the grim-faced doctor slowly walking out of the sterile operating room to deliver the horrific words that entirely destroyed her universe. They had quickly handed her a tiny, devastatingly light white coffin, which she personally buried beneath a weeping willow tree in the Grand Family Cemetery. She had spent countless hours weeping over that cold stone grave, eventually building her massive, billion-dollar corporate empire directly upon the bitter ashes of that unrelenting grief. She worked herself to total physical exhaustion simply to avoid thinking, feeling, or remembering the pain. But now Isabella pulled a second, extremely rare photograph from the very bottom of the velvet box. It was a close-up picture of Victoria taken just a few days after her miraculous birth. Right there, distinctly visible just beneath the infant's left ear, was a very tiny, perfectly round birthmark. It was the exact same, unmistakable mark she had seen clearly under Lily's ear earlier that afternoon. A frantic, desperate hope mixed with terrifying nausea churned wildly in Isabella's stomach. She knew she needed absolute proof. That very night, she hired Thomas, the most expensive and highly secretive private investigator operating in the entire state of South Carolina. She handed him the heavily guarded name of the rural orphanage and the exact tragic date from 22 years ago. While Thomas immediately began his deep dive into the shadowy past, Isabella also introduced Lily to Mr. Henderson, the estate's incredibly kind, elderly head gardener. The old man, who rarely spoke to anyone, instantly took a massive liking to the gentle young girl when she eagerly kneeled in the damp soil to help him carefully prune the magnificent blooming rose bushes. For the first time in over 2 decades, the Montgomery estate actually felt like it was breathing, completely alive with the sweet sound of Lily's beautiful laughter and her remarkably gentle, caring presence. 3 long, agonizing weeks passed by like a fleeting dream. Those 21 days completely transformed the silent, imposing Montgomery mansion into a warm, deeply vibrant home. Lily proved to be exactly the extraordinary, deeply compassionate person Isabella had instinctively sensed she was. She constantly helped Clara in the busy kitchen, completely refusing to sit idle, and spent her quiet evenings reading classic literature aloud to Isabella by the crackling fireplace. But while her days were filled with a blinding, joyful light, Isabella's nights were consumed by terrible, gripping anxiety as she obsessively read the detailed, shocking reports secretly delivered by the brilliant detective. Late one rainy Tuesday afternoon, Thomas walked briskly into Isabella's private study, holding a thick, heavy yellow envelope. He looked incredibly grim, taking a seat directly across from the massive mahogany desk without waiting for a formal invitation. "I found Dorothy Rivers," Thomas stated bluntly, offering no polite introductory remarks. "The former hospital nurse you hired me to track down is currently living in a very small, dilapidated trailer park located roughly 200 miles away from this city. She is extremely ill, Mrs. Montgomery, terminal cancer. The local doctors strongly believe she only has a few short weeks left to live." Isabella felt the warm blood completely freeze in her veins. She gripped the sharp edges of her wooden desk until her knuckles turned totally white. "Did you speak with her?" she demanded, her voice barely a rough whisper. "I did," Thomas replied, carefully opening the yellow envelope and pulling out several old, wrinkled documents along with a small digital audio recorder. "And I must tell you something incredibly important. The absolute second I mentioned your full name, that dying woman completely broke down into hysterical, uncontrollable tears. She told me she had been waiting 22 years for someone to finally come asking. She desperately wants to clear her terribly guilty conscience before she dies." Thomas handed Isabella a very old, faded copy of a hospital admission log. "Look closely at the discharge status column right next to your daughter's name," the detective instructed gently. Isabella's trembling eyes scanned the yellowed paper, and instead of the horrific words she expected to see, the document clearly stated that the infant had been transferred. "No," Isabella gasped, covering her mouth with her shaking hand. "No, this cannot be real." Thomas leaned forward, his face full of profound sympathy. "Your beautiful daughter absolutely did not die on that rainy night, ma'am. The terrible fever she suffered from was entirely real, but the resilient infant completely recovered. What actually happened was a massive, highly illegal bribe. Someone incredibly wealthy wanted that baby to permanently disappear, ensuring that you firmly believed she was dead and buried." "Who?" Isabella cried out, the agonizing pain of 22 lost years completely tearing her fragile soul to pieces. "Who would possibly do something so unbelievably monstrous to a grieving mother?" Thomas let out a heavy, tired sigh. "According to the nurse's sworn, recorded confession, the cruel order came directly from your late husband's own family, specifically from his greedy younger brother, Arthur." The entire room violently spun around Isabella. Arthur Montgomery, the bitter, deeply jealous man who had always lived entirely in the massive shadow cast by his highly successful older brother. The man who, when Edward tragically passed away just 3 years later, legally inherited exactly 1/2 of the massive corporate empire solely because there was absolutely no living child left to claim her rightful inheritance. Arthur had stolen her baby purely out of a disgusting, unquenchable thirst for immense financial power. Thomas continued speaking in a very calm, reassuring tone. The young nurse was offered fortune, but she simply could not bring herself to murder an innocent child. Instead, She drove deep into the countryside and abandoned the baby at the Sunny Ridge orphanage under a completely fake name, hoping the child would survive. Isabella could barely breathe through her heavy, racking sobs. To be absolutely certain, Thomas had already arranged for a highly confidential, incredibly accurate DNA test using a small hairbrush Clara had discreetly collected from the Blue Room. "I have the final laboratory results right here," Thomas said softly, handing over a pristine white paper. Isabella unfolded it with violently shaking hands. Her eyes locked onto the bold black numbers printed at the very bottom of the page. A 99.99% match. The hungry, homeless girl who had desperately begged for leftover fish was definitively, scientifically proven to be Victoria Montgomery, the sole rightful heir to the entire Montgomery fortune. Isabella slowly walked into the cozy, sunlit living room where Lily was quietly reading a thick novel on the plush sofa. Tears were streaming freely down Isabella's face, but for the very first time in decades, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She sat down directly next to the deeply confused young woman, reached out, and gently took both of her soft hands. "Lily," Isabella began, her voice thick with overwhelming emotion, "I need to tell you an incredible, miraculous story about a tiny baby girl who was cruelly stolen. A terribly evil uncle who lied for money, and a heartbroken mother who wept over an empty grave for 22 agonizing years." As Isabella carefully poured out the entire shocking truth, showing the DNA results and pointing out the matching birthmark, Lily dropped her heavy book onto the expensive rug. "You are my mother," Lily whispered, her voice breaking completely. "Yes, my beautiful Victoria, I am," Isabella sobbed, throwing her arms tightly around her daughter. They held on to each other fiercely, crying loudly in the beautiful room, finally filling the massive empty house with the profound, healing love that had been violently stolen from them so long ago. While the Montgomery mansion overflowed with immense, newfound joy and a profound sense of healing, a dark, incredibly dangerous storm was rapidly brewing in the shadowy, seedier parts of the city. Richard, the violently manipulative and incredibly cruel ex-boyfriend, who had intentionally forced Lily to sign fraudulent loans and ultimately driven her onto the unforgiving streets, had not stopped hunting for her. He knew she owed dangerous people a massive amount of money, and he fully intended to use her to save his own miserable life. After weeks of asking brutal questions in dark alleys, Richard finally tracked her all the way to the breathtaking gates of the magnificent Montgomery estate. He sat inside his rusted, completely beat-up car, smoking a cheap cigarette while staring furiously at the massive mansion. When he realized that the wealthy billionaire Isabella Montgomery had taken the homeless girl in, his dark, greedy eyes lit up with a totally sinister, deeply wicked realization. Richard was incredibly cunning. He spent several days silently stalking the estate, gathering valuable information, and eventually discovered the shocking, tightly guarded secret regarding the miraculous return of the long-lost heiress, Victoria Montgomery. Knowing exactly how much money was truly at stake, Richard managed to find the direct, private phone number of Arthur Montgomery, the very man who had originally orchestrated the horrific kidnapping 22 years ago. Richard arranged a highly secretive meeting with the wealthy, arrogant older man in a dimly lit, incredibly expensive private social club located downtown. Arthur, who was currently living an incredibly lavish lifestyle funded entirely by stolen, inheritance money, was completely terrified that his horrific crimes would be exposed, entirely ruining his pristine public reputation and sending him directly to a federal prison for the remainder of his life. "I can easily solve your massive problem, Ray," Richard sneered, taking a slow, incredibly arrogant sip of the expensive bourbon Arthur had reluctantly paid for. "I know this girl intimately. I successfully ruined her once, and I can easily, flawlessly do it again. But you absolutely cannot use brute violence. Isabella has far too much high-level security protecting that house now." Arthur narrowed his cold, calculating eyes, clearly intrigued by the ruthless younger man's proposition. "Then what exactly do you strongly suggest we do, you filthy little rat?" Arthur demanded, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disdain. Richard smiled, showing his slightly yellowed teeth. We simply plant the incredibly toxic seed of deep doubt. We will effectively make Isabella believe that Lily knew exactly who she was the entire time. We will frame the girl as a brilliant, highly sophisticated con artist who entirely staged that pathetic encounter in the fancy restaurant just to steal the family fortune. Over the next few days, anonymous, highly disturbing packages began arriving directly at the heavily guarded gates of the Montgomery estate. Clara brought the first large, unmarked manila envelope directly to Isabella's private study. Inside, Isabella found several highly manipulated, out-of-context photographs showing Lily standing right next to Richard on a dark street corner, accompanied by a typed, deeply malicious letter. The letter falsely claimed that Lily and Richard had spent many months carefully plotting to infiltrate the Montgomery household, staging the entire emotional restaurant scene to gain access to the massive bank accounts. When Isabella read the cruel words, a terrible, icy spike of pure fear pierced her healing heart. 22 years of brutal corporate betrayals had unfortunately taught her to constantly suspect absolutely everyone around her. For one brief, terrifying moment, the horrible poison of deep doubt successfully crept into her vulnerable mind. That exact same evening, Isabella walked slowly into the blue room, holding the fake photographs in her trembling hands. Lily took one look at the pictures of her terribly abusive ex-boyfriend and immediately burst into fearful tears. When Lily saw the painful, lingering hesitation deeply reflected in her mother's eyes, the horrific, silent question of whether her daughter was actually a cruel fraud, Lily's fragile heart completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. "You actually believe them," Lily whispered, her voice totally devoid of any hope. "After my entire life of being discarded like useless garbage, I truly thought I finally had a real mother who loved me. Keep your massive fortune, ma'am. I absolutely never wanted a single penny of your money." Lily immediately turned away, grabbed her old, completely ruined clothes, and began furiously packing her black trash bag, fully prepared to walk straight back out into the cold, unforgiving streets, rather than stay in a beautiful house where she was not trusted. Seeing her daughter absolutely willing to throw away billions of dollars just to preserve her own quiet dignity completely shattered Isabella's momentary doubt, proving once and for all that Lily's pure, beautiful soul was entirely incapable of such an evil deception. "Stop right there, Victoria!" Isabella practically shouted, her voice completely thick with raw, overwhelming emotion as she threw the fake, manipulated photographs directly into the burning fireplace. She rushed across the beautifully decorated bedroom and wrapped her arms fiercely around her deeply sobbing daughter. "Please forgive me, my precious child. I was so incredibly terrified of losing you again that I foolishly allowed the dark paranoia of my past business life to blind me for a brief second. A true con artist would have stayed and fought desperately for the money, but you were fully ready to walk away with absolutely nothing but your pride. You are my daughter, and I swear to you upon my very life, I will totally destroy the evil men who are trying to tear us apart." Lily slowly dropped her old, battered black bag, burying her tear-stained face deep into her mother's warm, comforting embrace, finally allowing herself to truly believe that she was entirely safe from the cruelty of the world. The very next morning, Isabella called William, her incredibly powerful, highly trusted corporate lawyer and the local chief of police, arranging an elaborate, perfectly planned trap. Knowing that Arthur was incredibly arrogant and deeply greedy, Isabella sent her brother-in-law a highly confidential, perfectly acted message. She falsely claimed that she had completely uncovered the girl's supposed fraud, that she was entirely devastated by the terrible betrayal, and that she urgently needed Arthur's expert legal assistance to quietly throw the young impostor out of the estate without causing a massive public scandal. Arthur, completely elated and arrogantly believing his wicked, malicious plan had worked flawlessly, eagerly agreed to come directly to the mansion that very afternoon, bringing his new criminal accomplice, Richard, closely along to witness his ultimate, glorious victory. When the two incredibly smug men confidently strutted into the grand, sunlit living room of the Montgomery estate, they fully expected to find Isabella weeping uncontrollably and Lily completely banished. Instead, they found Isabella sitting completely upright in a high-backed velvet chair, sipping Earl Grey tea with an expression of absolute, terrifying calmness. "Arthur," Isabella said softly, placing her delicate porcelain teacup gently onto the silver saucer, "you truly believed you could destroy my beautiful family twice and get away with it." Before Arthur could even open his mouth to offer a slimy, fake response, William the lawyer stepped out from behind the heavy silk curtains, firmly holding a small digital recorder. He loudly pressed play, and the unmistakable guilt-ridden voice of Dorothy Rivers, the dying nurse, echoed clearly throughout the entire room, detailing exactly how Arthur had paid a massive fortune to have the infant permanently disappear 22 years ago. Arthur's face turned completely chalk-white, all the arrogant, smug color instantly draining from his terrified features. Richard, realizing the situation was completely doomed, immediately turned toward the large oak doors to run away. But three heavily armed, unsmiling police officers quickly stepped directly into the room, physically blocking all possible exits. Arthur Montgomery and Richard Vance, the lead police officer, announced in a booming, highly authoritative voice, "You are both formally placed under arrest for the kidnapping of a minor, massive financial fraud, severe criminal extortion, and multiple counts of grand larceny." As the cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped tightly shut around their wrists, Lily bravely walked down the sweeping marble staircase. She stood tall and immensely proud next to her loving mother, staring directly into the deeply terrified eyes of the cruel men who had actively tried to ruin her entire existence. They were finally being dragged away to face true justice, leaving the Montgomery family completely safe, eternally united, and absolutely untouchable. Exactly 3 wonderful, deeply transformative years passed since the dark, dramatic day of the arrests. Arthur was rapidly tried, convicted, and sentenced to serve 30 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, utterly stripped of all his stolen wealth and false prestige. Richard received 15 years for his numerous, highly documented frauds and extortions, completely removing his toxic presence from the world. Isabella and Lily had spent those 3 beautiful years completely rebuilding their shattered lives, traveling extensively across beautiful European cities, talking for endless hours late into the night, and forging a bond so incredibly strong that absolutely nothing could ever break it. However, despite having virtually unlimited access to unbelievable wealth and unimaginable luxury, Lily remained exactly the same humble, deeply compassionate young woman who had once politely asked for a plate of leftover food. Lily successfully returned to the local university, studying incredibly hard late into the evenings to finally earn her teaching degree. However, she did not want to teach at an exclusive, wealthy private academy. Instead, she and Isabella combined their massive resources and deep compassion to establish the Victoria Montgomery Foundation. They purchased several large abandoned buildings in the poorest, most neglected neighborhoods of the sprawling city, and transformed them into beautiful, welcoming schools, totally free medical clinics, and incredibly warm, dignified dining halls for the local homeless population. Every single day, Lily stood proudly in front of a brightly colored classroom filled with underprivileged children, teaching them how to read, write, and confidently believe in their own boundless potential, constantly reminding them that their current poverty absolutely did not define their ultimate worth as human beings. One cool, breezy Tuesday afternoon, Isabella completely surprised her beloved daughter by having the professional driver take them straight back to the exact same fancy restaurant where their miraculous journey had first begun. Robert, the nervous manager, who was now endlessly polite and extremely deferential, quickly guided them to the very same table by the large glass window. Just as they were finishing their delicious, perfectly baked bread, a deeply frightened, terribly thin old man, wearing a torn coat, slowly pushed open the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. He looked around nervously, his deeply wrinkled face completely filled with profound shame as Robert immediately started walking aggressively toward him to throw him out. But before the manager could even speak a single word, Lily quickly stood up from her chair, her heart overflowing with empathy, and rapidly crossed the dining room floor. "Please, sir, you do not have to leave," Lily said in a beautiful, highly comforting voice, gently taking the deeply embarrassed old man by his trembling arm. "You are my highly honored guest today. Please come sit at our table. We have plenty of hot food to share, and you absolutely should not have to eat completely alone." As Isabella proudly watched her beautiful daughter pull out a heavy, comfortable chair for the incredibly grateful old man, a profound, overwhelming sense of total peace finally settled over her entire soul. She smiled warmly, signaling the waitstaff to bring their finest, most expensive meals for their new friend, knowing that the agonizing pain of her past had completely given way to a brilliant, immensely beautiful future. Life is a profound and completely unpredictable journey, often severely testing our fragile spirits with unbearable grief, terrible loneliness, and unimaginable betrayals. Yet it is solely through these very painful trials that the true depth of human compassion is ultimately revealed. When we finally grow older and much wiser, the glittering allure of massive wealth and the completely hollow pursuit of social status inevitably fade into the distant background, leaving behind the only true currency that actually matters in this universe: the unconditional love we share and the genuine kindness we freely extend to total strangers. The world can frequently be a cold, deeply unforgiving place that cruelly attempts to convince the vulnerable that they are completely worthless. But a single, courageous act of genuine empathy, looking deeply into the sad eyes of someone entirely forgotten and offering them a warm seat at the highly guarded table, has the miraculous power to beautifully alter the entire course of human destiny forever. We must absolutely never allow the deep, painful scars of past deceptions to permanently harden our beating hearts to the tragic point where we become entirely blind to the spectacular miracles standing right in front of us. True healing absolutely does not come from isolating ourselves behind massive walls of dark suspicion, but from bravely daring to trust, daring to reach out, and daring to passionately believe that even in the absolute darkest, most terrifying corners of human despair, the brilliant light of human goodness strongly endures. We are all deeply bound by the incredibly fragile thread of our shared humanity, and in the very end, it is our unwavering willingness to constantly uplift one another that truly finally saves our souls.